Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about what I think is one of the finest rock bands of all time, a quintessential rock band as good as your Deep Purples, Led Zeppelins, Uriah Heep's, Black Sabbath. It's one of these sort of quintessential bands of hard rock that really took the world by storm in the 70s and continued doing so, arguably even better in some ways, into the 80s. And yet, while they're wedged in between this period of the sort of Zeppelins that came out in the late 60s and the Van Halen that came out in the late 70s, this band was so influential and so good. And we can go into some of the reasons why. Now, the band started out, as their name would allude, as what was sort of a post psychedelic space rock band. Better than Hawkwind, frankly, but of that kind of sentiment, musical style, if you will. And the first albums, UFO 1 and UFO 2, did not land. Yeah, there's plenty of those to be had. But the band really came into its own and found the musical style that would carry itself forward throughout the remainder of its career with the 1974 release Phenomenon. You can really consider this the first real UFO album because it's when the first classic lineup solidified. So you've got Phil Mogg on vocals, who was the central figure in the band, Andy Parker on drums, Pete Way on bass, and the wonderful Michael Schenker, a guitar hero in his own right, on guitar. And the album was raw, it was heavy, and all of the songs were super well written. And that was sort of a hallmark of UFO through the remainder of their career. Really, really well written material. And that's what I think was sort of the key to their success, that consistency of good writing and, frankly, of good playing. 1975's Force It took this format even further, as did 1976's No Heavy Petting. But the album with that classic lineup that really solidified the band as a classic was the 1977 album Lights Out, an all-time classic. Again, this is one of those albums that passes my test of not having a single bad track on the album. Literally everything was a perfect track, and the band's sound got even bigger and more refined because, in addition to that quartet, Paul Raymond came in on keyboards and additional backing rhythm guitar, and it just made the sound. It took things from good to perfect. And this lineup continued with another follow-up classic in '78 with the album Obsession, and then capped things off with a live album the next year called Strangers in the Night, appropriately. The next big change to the lineup, arguably the biggest change in their career, came in 1980. When Schenker left the band, he would form his own band, and Paul Chapman came in on guitar, but they didn't miss a beat. Now, Chapman was already part of a band that I think was really good. They had two really nice albums, and they were called Lone Star, not to be confused with a later country and western act of the same name. But Lone Star were great. Again, great writing, great playing, and while some people, say, oh, the Schenker lineup is the only one I'll listen to, if anything, the writing got even better in the 1980s in the lineup with Chapman. Of course, the rest of the core lineup remained the same, with Mogg on vocals, Way on bass, and Parker on drums. Raymond, of course, stuck around on the keyboards. And the first album with this Chapman lineup on guitar was No Place to Run, which has the distinction of being produced by the fifth Beatle, George Martin. And while the album was sort of classic UFO, it didn't sound anything like the Beatles. That's an interesting side note. Then comes two albums, one after another, which are arguably two albums that are among their very best. First, there was The Wild, the Willing, and the Innocent in 1981, followed up by Mechanics in 1982. Both of these albums were absolutely perfect. Really, really good writing. I mean, really good. By now, they had a new keyboard player called Neil Carter, who also played some rhythm guitar. Very talented multi-instrumentalist. And again, the band didn't skip a beat. You wouldn't really know that anything had changed because the consistency of the writing, a lot of which is owed to Phil Mogg, who wrote or co-wrote just about all of the songs that they ever did. a central part of the band. Not only a really unique frontman, but a really good writer. And again, strength to strength. Now, the swan song of this album, of this lineup came the following year with Making Contact. By then, you already saw Pete Way leave on bass to form his own project. Paul Gray came in on bass, but the rest of the lineup remained intact for this Making Contact album in 1983. Again, they didn't skip a beat. Really, really consistent. Now, the biggest change at this point in their career probably happened in 1985, where virtually the whole lineup changed, which is something that didn't really happen before. Incrementally, people would come and go from the spacecraft known as UFO. But in 1985, a whole scale lineup was changed. So Phil Mogg, as I said, the consistent man on vocals, but you've got a new guitar player, you've got a new drummer. Paul Grape stayed on for bass, and Paul Raymond comes back on keyboards. Now, this album is frankly another one that you could say is one of their best, despite the extreme lineup change. This was from 85 and it was called Misdemeanor. Now, where all of the previous albums from 74 to around 83 really kept that classic 70s hard rock production style, by 1985, they decided to enter the 80s, and we all know what that means. It means you've got that heavily gated reverb drum, you've got the modern polyphonic synths of the day, but it is still a UFO album. They made the transition from the 70s hard rock production style to the 80s hard rock production style again seamlessly, and the reason for it remained the incredible writing of Phil Mogg. He was just someone who seemingly in his sleep could write wonderful rock tunes, and collaborating with different people over the years, he always made it work. A real, I would say, undersung, maybe even underappreciated lead vocalist. Now, by the late 80s and the 90s, the band's commercial heyday was over, but they continued to come out with really great material, and they continued to tour around the world until 2024. This was sort of the year that they sort of said farewell, with Phil Mogg, of course, being the man who steadied the ship through all these years. Um, Now, one of the things about this band that I think is really interesting is how musicians really like the band. Um, it's the kind of band where if you were to talk to anyone in other hard rock bands, or frankly, any kind of band, they would say, we were influenced by UFO. We couldn't believe how good UFO were. DJs, a lot of the, like Eddie Trunk, for instance, probably the most well-known hard rock DJ who sort of kept the flag of that dead genre, if you will, flying. He talks about UFO a hell of a lot. Now, the question is why for they sold records all over the world. The musicians loved them. Why didn't they achieve the iconic status of the Deep Purples and the Led Zeppelins of the world? And the answer to this is the same answer as to why certain posts on social media go viral and don't. The world hasn't changed, just the mechanisms have. They didn't have the consistent promotion from record labels behind them that they really needed. If they had that, I think they would have got further. Phil Mogg, as I said, a great, gritty frontman, but he wasn't a sex symbol like Robert Plant or Ian Gillan or a sort of wild man like David Lee Roth. He was just someone who sung really well and wrote really well. So that might have also been a problem in terms of convincing the PR departments to get behind UFO. But if you were to get rid of all of the hard rock bands of the 70s and 80s and keep just one, part of me would be inclined, apart from Van Halen, of course, to say maybe keep UFO because they were so consistent over so many years. They weathered both minor and major lineup changes without losing a step, without degrading quality or changing too much into unfamiliar territory that wouldn't have been good for the fans who were a loyal fan base over the years and still remain so. So, for those of you getting into this genre and really want to hear hard rock from that era at its best. Check out UFO. You will not be disappointed. Great songwriting, great production, great playing, everything but great publicity. But that mattered then. What matters now is their musical legacy, which is intact and frankly flying high. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.